B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Monday, January 14th, 2019. The New York Times has done it again in a Stop the Presses Friday night exclusive. The headline reads, FBI investigated if Trump worked for the Russians. Firing of Comey heightens suspicions. And predictably, the partisan believers in the Russiagate narrative seize upon this and say, collusion, what more do you need? But of course, when you actually read the story and you get to paragraph 11, and I hope this isn't a spoiler for you, paragraph 11 reads, no evidence has emerged publicly that Mr. Trump was secretly in contact with or took direction from Russian government officials. But that doesn't get in the way of a good story, because in the 10 paragraphs before that, they lay out that after Trump fired James Comey as FBI director, the Comey team at the FBI launched 2 investigations. One we have known about, and the other was secret. The one we've known about is the obvious case that Trump is accused of obstructing justice in firing Jim Comey to prevent further investigation of the Russiagate scandal. The second, which the Times makes a big deal out of, which has not been publicly known, is that they launched a counterintelligence investigation. Now, there are 2 very different ways to interpret this. One is that the dedicated employees at the FBI decided that the way their leader had been terminated raised serious questions about Trump and whether he had been compromised by Russia. That's the way Democrats and those who support Russiagate interpret this. But the other spin that can be placed on this is that angry loyalists of Jim Comey, when their boss was sacked, launched a vendetta to get Trump. And as I see the partisans embrace this story and claim that this is almost the end game, I see this as an exposure of foreplay. Because these 2 investigations were only independent for really about a week before Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, decided to appoint Bob Mueller. See how I screw up my FBI directors? To launch the special counsel investigation. And so I do not consider this big news. It basically just prompted a recap of all the allegations that remain unproven based on public evidence that comprise what has become this fable. Or, as I call it, related to Rachel Maddow's coverage, a telenovela. And so I again am prepared to wait for Bob Mueller's investigation to be completed. The latest indication is that it's expected to be just a couple of months before we get his report. And honestly, I don't believe those reports. I think that Mueller's going to go on for quite a while, because his investigation has led him into other arenas, very far from the original allegations. You know, Russia hacked the DNC, gave that to WikiLeaks, and Trump won the election because Putin favored him over Hillary. Now, it's no secret that Putin favored Trump over Clinton. The question is, what did he do to advance that desire? And we still don't have a full picture, but what has been revealed to date, leading to the 14 convictions, most of it irrelevant to the central allegations, as you know. The media coverage has taken on a life of its own. And, of course, it leads to the inevitable Twitter storm from Trump. It started 7 a.m. on Saturday morning. He accused Hillary Clinton without evidence of breaking the law by lying to the FBI. He claimed Comey was corrupt, best friends with Bob Mueller, said Mueller was employing a team of Democrats, another misleading assertion, bent on taking him down. And I love this. This is so delicious. The New York Times says that Trump compiled all the threads of the conspiracy theory he has pushed for many months in an effort to discredit the investigation. And they have no consciousness that they are pushing a conspiracy theory of their own, driven by anonymous leaks, evidence that they tell us exists, but the public hasn't been allowed to see. And new chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, hawkish Elliot Engel of New York, said his committee will hold hearings on the mysteries swirling around Trump's bizarre relationship with Putin and his cronies and how those dark dealings affect our national security. A little more on that a bit later in this podcast. And so I find this amazing, that people talk about the great journalism of the New York Times. This is yellow journalism. This is media malpractice of a very high degree. And the disclaimers that they write in their own articles. Here's another one. It is not clear whether Mueller is still pursuing the counterintelligence matter, and no public evidence has emerged that Trump himself secretly conspired with the Russian government or took directions from it. That's a variation on the disclaimer I just quoted a moment ago. And then, of course, the ridiculous pushback from Sarah Huckabee Sanders on Friday night. James Comey was fired because he's a disgraced partisan hack, and his deputy Andrew McCabe, who was in charge at the time, is a known liar fired by the FBI. Well, no, he was fired by Jeff Sessions. And it takes a liar to know one. Yes, McCabe did lie. Trump lies almost as often as he breathes, and Sarah Sanders echoes most of his lies. Now, I'm pleased to see that Glenn Greenwald has returned to the Russiagate story. He's been absent for quite a while. And he goes into the history vaults and points out that investigating a major political figure as a national security threat is from the playbook of former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. And he tells us in great detail about how Vice President Henry Wallace, who was a peacenik and challenged Harry Truman after FDR had died on the exaggerations of the threat from Moscow. And so because he was soft on Russia, does this ring a bell? Mr. Wallace was investigated by the FBI as a counterintelligence threat. And later on, they went after George McGovern. And the FBI learned that Senator McGovern had fathered a child without the benefit of marriage. And somehow the material ended up with the Nixon re-election campaign. And so we see the history of that. And I give Greenwald credit for reminding us of the history there. And he takes on the New York Times, noting they say that among the events prompting the investigation were that Trump refused to criticize Russia on the campaign trail, that the GOP softened its convention platform. So these are political moves. And Greenwald believes there should be a firewall. And I think that is a fair assessment. So it's a fascinating look. I'll link to it. Please read Greenwald's commentary and see what you think. Now we go to the issue that arose in a blockbuster New York Times story last week, where they said that Paul Manafort had sent polling information while he was working as Trump's campaign manager, and they admit that most of it was public polling information, you know, like the New York Times poll, and that a little bit of it was the private polling information from the campaign. That's an important distinction because as I read about it in various outlets, they drop the part about public information and stress only that Manafort sent some private polling data. Now, the suggestion is that this was used to target those pernicious Facebook ads that took down the Clinton campaign through the meddling in the election, and we've covered that before. And the Facebook effort was so insignificant. We still have no information that it was targeted at the key states that decided the election. And every analysis shows that only less than half the money ran before the election. The ads ranged from silly to ridiculous. And yet we're all supposed to, Russia, they meddled in our election and they brainwashed all of us. So, the story broke on January 8th, claiming that Manafort shipped this data to Konstantin Kilimnik and that he handed it off to Oleg Deripaska, the oligarch who is so close to Putin, they breathe in synchronism. I don't know. Anyway, this is where Clint Watts, the FBI guy, former FBI and a big promoter of Russiagate, said this is the closest thing we have seen to collusion. The closest thing. But they've been claiming collusion for 2 bloody years now. And here is the disclaimer about the nature of the information that Manafort shared. Most of the data was public, but some of it was developed by a private polling firm working for the campaign. But the truth is, we don't really know what was included. So here is the corrected paragraph in the New York Times Dispatch. Manafort asked Gates to tell Kilimnik to pass the data to 2 Ukrainian oligarchs named Livokhin and Akhmetov. The oligarchs had financed Russian-aligned Ukrainian political parties that had hired Manafort as a political consultant. Now, that's another lie. When Manafort worked for Yanukovych, he was pressing him to align with Europe, with NATO and the EU, and not with Russia. And Yanukovych ignored Manafort's advice on that. But hey, again, facts can't get in the way of a good story, right? But at the very end of the article, there is a correction. And that correction has been buried. I will read it in its entirety. A previous version of this article misidentified the people to whom Paul Manafort wanted a Russian associate to send polling data. Manafort wanted the data sent to 2 Ukrainian oligarchs, not to Oleg V. Deripaska, a Russian oligarch close to the Kremlin. Now, they corrected their story the same day they published it. But here we are nearly a week later, and that correction has not reached the Washington Post. Because their breathless story today, revelations about Manafort's 2016 interactions with Russian associates show special counsel's intense focus on Russia contacts, including the fact that Manafort shared polling data about the race with an associate who allegedly has ties to Russian intelligence. Now, that is a veiled reference to Deripaska. But they are not correcting the misinformation that is circulated widely, that Manafort told Kilimnik to get the info to Deripaska. And the Post goes on, the new information about Manafort indicates Mueller has been exploring what he may have communicated to Russians while working for Trump. This is speculation. And let me speculate in return. If Mueller is exploring all this, why did he wrap up the indictments and trials of Manafort without any hint of violations related to collusion, related to this data transfer to Kilimnik? It does not make sense. But again, that would get in the way of their narrative. And so I just keep scratching my head. Here's another quote from the Post article related to the Manafort court filings, and his lawyers have contended that Mueller has never turned over evidence to show that Manafort was in contact with Russian government or intelligence officials, suggesting that prosecutors have not detailed their evidence claiming Kilimnik was a Russian intelligence operative. And so, friends, I know that this is tedious. And there are some people who've checked out from the Peter B. Collins podcast because they think I'm just beating a dead horse. But this is really crucial. Most of the country is being swept up by bad reporting that really rises to the level of propaganda. And if we don't try to correct these as they come by, They just become part of a wall of information that people treat as fact. And we're in a bad way, a very bad way as a result. Now, over on Capitol Hill, the Senate Democrats intend to force a vote this week on the Trump administration's efforts to lift sanctions on Oleg Deripaska. And I have to say that the Democrats have the upper hand on that little tussle. Separately, Adam Schiff over at the House Intelligence Committee, now chairman, Democrat of California, he's asking his Republican colleagues to support his effort to get notes or testimony from the interpreter in one of the private meetings that took place between Trump and Putin. Now, I do agree that it's weird. Trump acts very strangely about Russia and about Putin. The secret meetings raise more questions than they answer. His own staff members, top advisors, were unable to get any details on the secret meeting in, it wasn't Copenhagen, in Northern Europe, you can recall. At any rate, several administration officials asked the interpreter what had been discussed. The interpreter told them the president had taken the notes after the meeting and instructed the translator not to discuss the meeting. So I realize this raises a lot of eyebrows, and people who are captive to the whole Trump-Russia narrative see this as just further proof. But I remain skeptical, and I encourage you to do the same. So today, the Supreme Court refused to hear a challenge to the temporary posting of Matt Whitaker as Attorney General. And I have to say that my fears that he was going to do something nasty to the Mueller investigation have not played out so far. And meanwhile, the replacement for Jeff Sessions, a retread who served as Attorney General under Poppy Bush, William Barr, is trying to assure Congress that Bob Mueller is safe. If confirmed, I will not permit partisan politics, personal interests, or any other improper consideration to interfere with this or any other investigation. And he says, hey, I know Bob. Yeah, we worked together at Justice back in the 90s. And he further said, I will follow the special counsel regulations scrupulously and in good faith, and on my watch, Bob will be allowed to complete his work. Yeah, right. New York Times lead headline on Sunday raises questions about Barr's fitness to return as Attorney General. They want him to recuse himself. And the only part of his ugly history that they cite was that he recommended that George H.W. Bush pardon all of the Iran-Contra criminals from the Reagan era, and Bush did do that. But let's dig a little deeper. The fine folks over at the Global Research site in Canada do a takedown of Barr. He was a full-time CIA operative starting in 1971. He was assigned to the China Directorate, which is where he became close with George H.W. Bush. Then Bush became CIA director and brought Mr. Barr into the inner circle as a CIA legal office member. Barr stonewalled and destroyed the Church Committee investigations into CIA abuses. He stonewalled inquiries into the CIA bombing, assassination of Chilean opposition leader Orlando Letelier. He joined Bush's legal and intelligence team during the vice presidency, and he rose from assistant attorney general to chief legal counsel to attorney general during the Bush 41 presidency, a key player in the Iran-Contra operation, and also he blocked investigations into BCCI and BNL, the Banco Nazionale Lavoro, the Italian bank. And so it's quite an ugly, sordid history. And just like Gina Haspel, you know, when you go to get confirmed and you have a spook history, oh, you can count on the members of the Senate, even the opposition, to just overlook it and forget about it. And that's what's going to happen here. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Paul Tomaselli, the incredible Faith Peoples, Joan Fauber just renewed her annual subscription, Ethan Knox kicks in $5 a month. Can you do it too? That's my question of the moment. Come on over to peterbcollins.com, find the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber, you land on the sign-up page, and boom. You can choose a level of support that fits your budget. And if you're allergic to PayPal, yo comprendo. My mailing address is Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Mike Pompeo says he gave a tough talk, there we go, to Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia in his early 30s, the Crown Prince. And the headline of the New York Times is such a hoot. Pompeo presses Saudi leader on war, murder, and rights abuses. And of course, through it all, he assured MBS that it's not really any problem that Saudi Arabia killed Khashoggi at the consulate there in Istanbul. We have to make some noise about it. We have to satisfy our domestic critics, but don't you worry. Everything's going to turn out all right. Meanwhile, Trump is roiling the diplomacy, the efforts by Pompeo and John Bolton to overrule the president's decision to bring troops out of Syria. And part of the issue is protecting the Kurds, who will be eviscerated by Turkey if the U.S. doesn't stop it. And so now Trump is talking about, first he threatens Turkey, will devastate Turkey economically if they hit the Kurds. Likewise, we don't want the Kurds to provoke Turkey. So Trump he's suggesting a 20-mile safe zone around the Kurds, and that's kind of ordering Syria to allow the creation of a Kurdistan. Now, I support a Kurdistan, but there's this sticky little issue of the sovereignty of Syria, and that the U.S. is not in a position to dictate how all this plays out. It is just amazing. Now, there are leaks from the Pentagon against John Bolton, revealing that last year he contacted the Pentagon after there was an incident where 3 rockets were fired into an empty lot on the grounds of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and Iranian forces were blamed. And so Bolton wanted to get the Pentagon to issue some options for Trump to consider in retaliation. But Mad Dog Mattis was running the shop, and he adamantly opposed retaliating, arguing that the attack was insignificant, a position that ultimately won out. So the purpose of this leak appears to be to undermine John Bolton, and that's coming from this guy Shanahan, the acting Secretary of Defense, who, of course, had a 31-year career with Boeing before he came to the Pentagon. So it's a real college of clowns, and a little bizarre to watch these days. I want to recommend to you that you follow the link in the show file for my podcast over to Consortium News to Daniel Lazar's publication of a memo that was written by Jamie Rubin for the signature of Hillary Rodham Clinton. And it really is the blueprint, faulty as it was, that led Obama to change his position and to covertly support the forces trying to take out Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And this memo that Jamie Rubin wrote, it's a 1,200-word piece, is important to note who Jamie Rubin is. He was a diplomat in Bill Clinton's State Department and then a high-ranking official in Hillary Clinton's office when she was Secretary of State. And he's married to Christiane Amanpour, the CNN anchor. And his memo includes a quote from an interview that Mrs. Rubin did with Israeli Defense Minister at the time, Ehud Barak. And there's no mention of that connection in this article, or, of course, the memo doesn't say, hey, and by the way, my wife interviewed Ehud Barak, but it shows just the tight connections between media and the diplomatic machinery. Anyway, it's a juicy memo. I encourage you to read it. Here's one quote. Bringing down Assad would not only be a massive boon to Israel's security, it would also ease Israel's understandable fear of losing its nuclear monopoly. We're not supposed to admit they have nukes. Then Israel and the United States might be able to develop a common view of when the Iranian program is so dangerous that military action could be warranted. So it's Syria, and then it's Iran. That was the hawkish view of Hillary Clinton. One more quote. Iran would be strategically isolated, unable to exert its influence in the Middle East. The resulting regime in Syria will see the United States as a friend, not an enemy. Washington would gain substantial recognition as fighting for the people in the Arab world, not the corrupt regimes. What? And then Lazar also acknowledges how similar thinking led to the mess in Libya. A couple of quick items here before I run out of time today. Bibi Netanyahu made a bold move that appears to be part of his re-election campaign effort. He broke protocol and confirmed that Israel bombed an Iranian weapons depot in Syria. And he issued threats, said that they blew up some tunnels, and just generally postured about this. But it is unusual that he acknowledged it, and it does cause disruption in his cabinet. Not everybody signed on to that. And Ian Berman wrote in response to a recent podcast about the Christmas Day bombing of Damascus by Israel. And he said, "You made a comment about the Israeli fighter jets flying behind a civilian airliner in Lebanon. At first you seemed to question the incident, but then you threw out a mitigant, something to the effect of, well, you might think it is a clever strategy." Now, one of the reasons I was a little, how can I say, soft on this allegation is I only had a single source accusing Israel of this incident. And so I didn't want to overstate it because I don't have a clear fact set. But I share Ian's concern that this kind of a maneuver deliberately puts civilians in harm's way, and that it is a war crime, and that this is something that should not be tolerated. Ian, thank you for your thoughtful comment on that. A judge here in the Bay Area in Oakland has issued a temporary injunction, but it only affects 13 states and the District of Columbia. And that is an injunction that blocks the activation of the birth control rules that the Trump administration has imposed. And these claim to respect religious liberty of corporations. And that's such a crock of shit. Because corporations don't have religion. Nevertheless, we're told that even publicly traded companies can deny to providing contraceptive benefits to their employees based on a claim of religious liberty. Trump rejected a plan to end the shutdown that was put forward by Lindsey Graham. And meanwhile, Dave Dayen over at The Intercept notes that at the IRS that is nominally shut down, they're still robotically generating collection notices to people. And he talks about a company called Mr. Holmes Bakehouse that is in a collection process from the government. Their vendor that handles their payroll tried to pay the payroll taxes to the IRS, got posted to the wrong account. IRS is threatening to seize property and cash from the company. And this is one of those things that can be worked out if you could just call somebody at the IRS. And tomorrow is the day when people like me who are self-employed have to file our estimated taxes. But there's nobody to receive them and nobody to penalize us if we don't. But they'll get us eventually, I know that. The rogue utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, that I have sharply criticized over the years, is melting down. In the wake of the liabilities they face from 2 years of wildfire disasters, many of those fires attributed to PG&E equipment, the CEO, Geisha Williams, has stepped down. That follows house cleaning of other top executives. The company's general counsel will be the interim CEO. And PG&E is ripe for a takeover by another utility, but I hope the state of California will buy it. Their shares are they've dropped so precipitously, 40% today alone, that California could buy control for less than $10 billion. I hope Gavin Newsom is thinking big about that. The story made the national media today, and some of it is a little bit misleading, but accurate enough. Want to note that Bo Hodai has published a third installment in his series, which exposes how Warren Buffett's son, Howard, has used millions of dollars to buy influence and property along the southern border so he can play vigilante games with the approval of the local cops. And in this particular installment, Bo Hodai notes the Trump-like lies or exaggerations that they have made in testimony about the risk of immigrants coming across the border. And the sheriff, Daniels, of Cochise County, told Congress, let's see, we face reckless, aggressive, and violent people, reckless high-speed pursuits, assaults on citizens, rapes, kidnappings, murders, and home invasions. And when Bo Hodai carefully analyzes these claims and looks at the statistics, it shows that there are only a handful of cases in each of those cited, and that most of the victims are the immigrants themselves, not American citizens. On Friday, I commented on Trump and the way he seizes on individual crimes and then exaggerates, generalizes about them. And we know that from the incident where Officer Singh of Newman, California, was killed during the Christmas holidays by a man who turned out to be undocumented. And I predicted that Trump will never make a comment on the case of the rookie cop, a female, who was randomly and brutally shot and killed by a resident of her town, Davis, California, last week. We now know the identity of this man, and I think it ensures that Trump and that radical guy on the radio will never mention his name, because the suspect who ambushed and killed the officer and then killed himself is named Kevin Douglas Limbaugh. He's 48 years old. He's an American. He's white. They had tried to take guns away from him in the past, and he said that he had been hounded by ultrasonic waves that provoked him to take this action. And finally, today, a federal magistrate judge here in California has ruled that Hamid Hyatt should be released from prison because of bad lawyering and other defects in his prosecution as a so-called domestic terrorist back in 2004. I covered this case, and it was the first that alerted me to the frame-ups that the FBI has employed in hundreds of domestic terrorism cases since. I hope the judge's ruling will be upheld on appeal and that Hamid Hyatt will be free soon. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast on Mondays. It runs a little long because there's a lot to talk about. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.